Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning. I can see that you all had an interesting evening. Well, thank you for being here. We're going to be talking about myths, ayahuasca myths. All of the world populations, all of the world peoples have their own myths, what we call myths. They're stories, they're tales, although for them they were truth, just like for a Catholic, the Bible is true. So everybody has their own stories about how the world came to be. They're called cosmogonic myths. And also tales about how man came to be, how man came to the world. Those are anthropogenic myths. And also tales or myths about how plants or animals came to be. Edible plants or hallucinogenic plants. I've been gathering myths about hallucinogenic plants all over the world. I've written 2 books with 20 years in between. One of them also in Spanish, hallucinogenics and myths. The peoples who use ayahuasca and jagé, they all have their own myths about how ayahuasca and jagé came to be. There are lots. I'm going to focus on just one of them. It's about the myth of the goddess woman. It's one of the most wonderful myths, not just amongst ayahuasca myths, but origin myths for hallucinogenic plants. It comes from the Tucanos peoples in Colombia. The myth is placed in time shortly after the first men arrived on this world. The first men arrived for the Milky Way through a canoe. The celestial anaconda, the celestial snake, brought them on a canoe. It was this canoe, and it landed on the jungle. The first men, all of them male men, came from the canoe, and first of all they built their first Malacca, the first people's home in the Amazonian. In that Malacca, in some versions it says the men were waiting. In other versions it says the men were looking for something. They were seeking something that the god Father Sun had promised to send them. What it had promised was a drink, a brew, a visionary, important brew, which had a particular purpose, and we'll see why Father Sun will send it. So the men in the Malacca are drinking cacherie and other kind of fermented beers, and they're chatting. And at a certain moment in time, Father Sun in the Malacca, it was called the Casa de las Aguas, the House of Waters. Father Sun creates a woman, Nayeh. Nobody realizes it. And he creates it already adult and already impregnated, because he impregnates it through his regard. Amongst many Amazonian ethnia, there is this belief that if a woman looks directly at the sun, she'll fall pregnant. So we have this adult woman ready for delivery. And when she realizes that it's the time to be delivered of her baby, she leaves the Malacca. As I said, the men don't even realize this is all happening. So she leaves the Malacca and she walks in the jungle. So she walks and walks until she delivers her baby. Her first baby, is not female, it's not male. Her first baby is the Jagé liana. It's getting dark. The woman washes the baby from the placenta, from the blood, nurses the baby, and in the evening she goes back to the Malacca. The baby Jagé is emanating a huge light, a wonderful red glow light. Everything is dark, but the Jagé woman can see the path because the liana is emanating, it's radiating this glow which lights her path. So when she reaches the Malacca, and there's all these men chatting and drinking kashiri and whatever, the moment she walks into the Malacca, all of the men get frozen. They're shaky. They're terrified. They don't know what's happening. There's a huge silence falls on the Malacca. And the Jaja woman, she walks into the center of the Malacca. She looks at all these men who are frozen in terror. And she asks, who is the father of the baby she's holding in her arms? All of the men look at one another. They're paralyzed with terror until one of them is brave enough to say, me, I'm the father. And with a little bit of metal that he has, he builds a knife and cuts a little bit of the umbilical cord that the baby has. Another man feels very courageous as well, and he says, no, me, I am the father. He does the same thing, and he cuts off a toe of the baby. And in turn, all of the men say, I am the father, I am the father. They're all the father of the baby. And each of them cuts off a little bit of the baby. They tear the baby apart, and they all have a little bit. And that is the first liana of Jaja, which they then take to their peoples. And that's how the Jaja liana is spread throughout the Amazonian forest. This is a wonderful myth. It's full of what myth scholars called mythologies, which are the main themes of myths. There are too many of them, so I'll focus on a couple on these mythologies. First, we have the mythology of the tearing apart the baby Jaja. For those of you who know Greek mythology, you will soon realize that this is a Dionysiac myth. Dionysus, the god of not just wine, which is what he's known for. Dionysus was the god of altered states of conscience, which are arrived to through vegetable matter, because at a point in the Dionysus myth, he's dismembered by the Titans, whatever. So there is that element of Dionysus. And it goes beyond that, because it's a shamanic myth. We find it in the shamanism of Siberia, shamanism of Central Asia, North America, in this myth of the Jaja woman. For a man to become a shaman or a shaman, has to go through the experience of having his body torn apart and then coming back together. It's the experience of dying and coming back to life. So let's look at this Jaja woman. The Jaja woman is not just any old woman. It's the first woman in the world. Her first delivery, she gives birth not to a human being, but to the Jajalian. And this is my interpretation, but looking at not just this myth, but all myths, world myths of the origin of hallucinogenic plants, I think that she's also the first shaman. So the first shaman was not a man, it was a female, a woman. This takes us directly to something which is very important, and that is the role played by women in birth, in creation, or in the discovery of hallucinogenic plants, intoxicating plants. I always look at all the myths of intoxicating plants, and I often see that there are women who are creators or discoverers of intoxicating plants. We find this, for example, in the myth of coca. In several coca myths, we find that it's a woman who is transformed into the coca plant. And we find this into the Kaba Kaba myth. Kaba Kaba is a sacred plant in Oceania. They use the root. And in the myth, the first root comes from the vagina of a woman. And she's not just, again, any old woman. She's the first woman on earth. So we find the role played by women in San Pedro with Chuma. Nowadays, it's true that the curanderos who heal with Wachuma are mostly males, but there are some women who heal with Wachuma today. But in the past, the old texts, and particularly archaeology, tell us clearly that the healing role through a Wachuma was played by women. We have archaeological data. We have wonderful vasillas from the Wambayeco culture, or Motsem, even older, pre-Inca peoples, who clearly tell us that there are women who drink San Pedro and who heal the sick. So there is clearly a role played by women in discovering how chicha is made, or kawima. Chicha is this kind of fermented beer, alcoholic, which you get through maize, from maize. And how is it built from the beginning? Well, you take a handful of maize, you put it in your mouth, chew it, and then the maize bolo, you put it in a pot, boil it, and from that you get the chicha, the beer. And you might think, but who had that idea of putting food in your mouth, chew it, and then rather than swallowing it, you spit it out and boil it? I mean, it's pretty weird. Who thought of that? Well, women did. Women are the mothers. For a mother, when the baby needs to start eating solid food, not just milk, at the very beginning, mothers don't just give maize to the baby. No, mothers chew the maize a little bit. They soften it and then they regurgitate it and give it to their baby. This is a behavior which is also seen in primates, monkeys and other primates. So it's clearly there that women saw that they could take food from their mouth and use it for something, and that's where the chicha technique comes from. We also have the role played by women in Iboga, this wonderful visionary plant from Africa, from equatorial Black Africa jungle. I spent over 10 years studying Iboga amongst the Bantu and other peoples in Gabon. I studied their religious cults, Buite amongst others. Iboga is one of the big mother plants. I myself believe that the time has come for Iboga to get to the Amazonian woods. It can grow there, the soil is similar, it's a very good environment, a very good habitat. This is a message that Iboga is sending to many people. Please take me to the Amazon. But well, that's a different matter altogether. In the myths of origin of Iboga, there is the story of Manzioko, or Momo, has many names. It's a woman. It's the first woman who discovers the effects of Iboga. Well, she doesn't discover them. It's the Evu, the spirits of the jungle, of the African jungle, who tell Banzioko, they say, Banzioko, eat this plant so that you can see us. The Ibu are the ancestral spirits. So Banzioko eats the Iboga, and she sees her dead husband and she sees her ancestors. So every day she goes to the jungle, she eats Iboga, and she gets in contact with the past and with her ancestors. But the men in the village don't like it. They don't like that it's a woman who has the power of Iboga, until one of those men kills her, he throttles her, and he takes over the power of Iboga. And ever since, even up until today, the power of Iboga is in the hands of men, at least amongst the African Bantu population. This tends to happen in myths, not just for intoxicating plants, but also for feeding plants. There is an original role played by woman who discovers the power of the plant, and she guides the power of the plant. And in the myth, there comes a moment when the man takes that power, sometimes through violence, like the story of Bansoko. He takes that power from her. This probably reflects a reality which is the passage from matriarchal societies, or societies where women had more power, to more modern patriarchal societies. So the role played by women in the discovery, in the arrival of intoxicating plants, is something that I find, as I said before, in myths all over the world. Now, coming back to the Jage woman, we've seen how the Jage woman is the first woman in creation. It's very likely that she's the first shaman in humanity. As I said, it's the father-son who sends the Jage woman to mankind, and he impregnates her. Why? Well, he gives us the Jage to humanize men, to humanize mankind, because it wasn't enough with creating men. They had to be humanized. Even today, Ayahuasca, Jage, humanizes us. That is the goal, the purpose of the being of these plants, not just ayahuasca, but sacred plants. The sacred plants humanizes. And if you see in your visions, when you drink ayahuasca, yagé, natem, the tea, the brew, whatever you call it, when you take ayahuasca, when you drink it, you might see, I don't know, jaguars, anacondas, pictures that might appear to be male. But if you look closely, you might see that behind that picture there is a visionary background, there is a visionary basis, which is female. This female visionary basis has always been, and is always, and will always be the Jage woman. Thank you.